I feel like I'm building this up a little too much, and it's gonna make it even worse. But if it's not funny, that'll be funny itself. So okay, so my professor, she was explaining that she went to this interview for a teaching position at a university, and the professor that was interviewing her was like, okay, who do you think is the most overrated philosopher? And she's like, Hegel. He's too wordy. He's not really actually saying anything. It's just awful. Just and she goes on for a little while, and then it turns out that professor had basically spent his like professional life just like dissecting Hegel and the value of Hegel and all these things. And yeah, she did not get the job. And then I was like, well, if that professor was a real Hegelian, he would have worked through the contradictions and actually achieved some kind of, you know, an Aufgeheben out of all this. It would have come to some kind of a greater universalization of these things, but it didn't happen. That's it.
I don't have. I was going to go review this stuff that we were supposed to read this time. I did read it. I was going to go back and review it, and so I could come up with a clever opening question, but I failed to do that. So I don't have a clever opening question. So somebody can either crank the thing up, or I'm going to start looking at my. Oh, by the way, oh, never mind. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, so I'm going to stare at my screen for a minute, and then if nobody says anything, I'll come back shortly.
So
Well,
a thing that I found amusing was how much of our introduction was building up to the idea that this was going to focus on metaphysics. And then Schelling just spent this entire section talking about free will. I think he had good reasons to be talking about free will, but it's completely hilarious to me that that was the thing that I, I interpreted from that wasn't going to be what we were talking about, and then it was all we talked about.
hmm.
Well, I think because at least like I'm like reading that like Heidegger commentary alongside, and he's kind of how is Schelling like plugging the idea of free will like into metaphysics or into like ontology. At least for me, like just it was clicking there, like why Heidegger sought interest in it, because I think it's like maybe page 22 or so, where he starts talking about Kant's failure to like go a step farther and plug human freedom
That was a good
back into like the freedom of the
lot of
things
notations on here.
kind of like what's happening, and kind of like the concern with freedom in general, and how human freedom is like distinct and unique, its specificity. And at least that to me was like the reference that he's going to plug human freedom back into things themselves as a way of like opening us back up to metaphysics. But somewhere on 22 is where you kind of like makes that reference about concern with freedom in general.
Yes, I like this idea he has that he's going to kind of synthesize idealism and realism. And idealism is the formal formal freedom or something like that. But then it lacks a kind of definite principle of realism, and seems like that's what he's wanting to do. Which yeah, seems interesting to me. Go for it, Schelling.
Yeah, the paragraph I stopped at was where he had said like the idealism, like it must be accompanied by that real and vital concept of the capacity for good and evil. I guess I thought it was really interesting him kind of showing how the idea that idealism is supposed to like rid us of any concern of pantheism or realism, when idealism is just the other side of it. And I think like Schelling in general too, at least some of the stuff I've read, commentaries, or maybe like, I think actually one of the little snippets of Schelling we have in the 19th century reader from research class, it says something about how he like approaches philosophy from two different angles in like each of his phases or whatever. And in this phase of his philosophy, he's trying to like synthesize those, find what he calls like the indifference point, kind of find an integration of the two angles he's been like oscillating between. And I think I see some of that already in these early pages where he's talking about realism and necessity being like one side of it, and then idealism being another side of it, and how we kind of like bring those together.
I'm going to be interested to see exactly what he means by by freedom. You know, I'm assuming that one reason he thinks that, I guess what he's calling, well, he has these different names for realism, but you know, he talks about, quote, dogmatism, which I gather, and this is actually from that 19th century reader, one of the common, I forgot who was using that term. I think it was Fichte that was using that term. And when and I'm assuming Schelling's using it the same way, but what this commentator says when they talk about dogmatism, they're talking about dogmatic, what we might call dogmatic materialism or physicalism, where, you know, there is nothing exists except matter, or matter and energy. And I can see why, you know, why he would say that doesn't allow freedom, at least if you know, today it's gotten weird because of quantum weirdness and that, but if you assume that the material world is a causally closed system, then it's hard to get any kind of freedom out of that. Open the way to freedom. But then, you know, then in Kant, actually, I mean, these seminars are mixing together. So I think, you know, Sean was talking about Kant, I think, a couple of days ago in the Kafka. And so, you know, for Kant to act freely is to act rationally, because really there's only two options. You're a slave to your inclinations, or you do what makes sense, which is to act rationally. And so the rational will, when you act out of the rational will, that's the only kind of real freedom we have, is to act rationally. But then Fichte or Schelling seems, I get the impression because he doesn't like Kant's analysis of freedom. So, you know, he doesn't, I'm just curious as to what he means exactly by freedom. So if he clearly thinks that sort of materialistic determinism eliminates the possibility of freedom, and I guess he's talking about the free will. He seems to not really think that Kant has an adequate explanation of freedom. And so I'm just curious, you know, I don't really know yet what he means by freedom, and maybe that's just something we're going to have to wait to see. I don't know yet anyway.
You said something that interested me earlier when you were talking about the sort of dogmatism, meaning dogmatic physicalism. There was somewhere in the text that I was trying to look up. I have it digitally, so I was trying to scroll to find it, where I put that, you know, the individual finds themselves between doing pure reasoning. We find no concrete freedom. And I think this was what in the introduction was Kant's paradox, because if you look rationally and you find yourself having the inclination to do evils, then the fact that you're inclined, you know, does that allow for freedom? Versus what the text termed immediacy as freedom. And from what I understand of freedom, this is a sort of question I actually have, is just not thought upon, not expounded upon, just belief in a sense. So you can get it from religion, or you can get it from other venues, maybe. So that reminded me what you said earlier, that Kant's conception of freedom, Schelling doesn't really like that, and it seems to lead to no concrete freedom, actually. And the first part of our reading, talking about pantheism and how it always leads to fatalism, and so a lack of freedom, I think, goes into that. So I hope I'm making sense here.
Yeah, so one of the things about pantheism that kind of overshadows a lot of this, and he's constantly making references to this, is the pantheism controversy, which was so in the supplemental text to this book, they have the letters exchanged with who's it's like Jacobi and I forget the other person, but essentially the controversy was about a well-known author, Lessing, admitting that he was a Spinozist, and Spinoza was a pantheist and pretty much a determinist. But back then, basically, pantheism was just considered atheism because that's how, if somebody disagrees with, whatever your brand of theism is, just call them an atheist because you don't understand it. And so basically, the controversy was either you use reason. So this is the way that Jacobi kind of formulated it, is basically we either have to choose something like Spinoza's philosophy, which is a deterministic pantheism that follows reason, and there's no room for any kind of belief in God or whatnot, or you just simply follow faith and believe in freedom and in God and say, screw reason, we don't need that. Those are basically the choices he formulated, and Schelling keeps referencing this throughout the text, especially the idea that, and I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to defend pantheism against the idea that it automatically equates to determinism. Because I think his philosophy, I believe, is pretty much a pantheism, at least it seems like to me. And he's sort of trying to show how you can build off of Spinoza. So he talks about Spinoza as something that's not yet really complete. It's just that Spinoza kind of gave the groundwork for these things, but he made some mistakes, and basically it needs to be more dynamic. It needs this kind of vital principle of idealism and whatnot kind of thrown in there. So I think that's kind of what he's doing, and that kind of situates a lot of this stuff here. But he hasn't really gone into much detail about his concept of freedom, because I think that's what's so basically, I think that basically this book, it takes him like the whole book to really spell it out, because it has to do with, the ground of existence, or the ground in existence, and this relation between them, I think. But I think it is interesting, in reference to Kant, kind of what he's saying there is that Kant recognized that things in themselves related to, I guess, people at least, are free. But he's saying that concept of freedom is negative, but it's not exactly saying what it is. It's just simply saying, oh, they're things in themselves, we can't say anything about them. We just know that it's not temporal, it's not causal, so therefore it's free. And there's nothing definite about that. And he's saying instead, why don't we apply that to everything, actually? And so what is the line he has here? I don't know if I'll be able to find it. So he basically says that instead of just thinking that people in a negative, non-specific kind of way have freedom, we need to actually extrapolate out from that idea that these things in themselves, that everything as, freedom can actually ground the kind of basic ontology of these things in some way. So it seems like that's where he's really building off the concept that Kant is working with, and also Spinoza's kind of modal metaphysics of participation with the divine and all of that. So yeah.
I just wanted one of the reasons people call Spinoza's pantheism atheism is because if you make so from what I understand, strict pantheism, at least of Spinoza's kind, makes the material world and God literally identical. They are exactly the same. There is no distinction. And so then if the material world is a closed causal system, then so is everything else. And so that necessarily eliminates the possibility of freedom. That doesn't mean that, maybe there's not other kinds of pantheism, like you said, maybe Schelling's trying to propose that would avoid that problem. But that's I think why, people say that. And the other comment I want to make is, to make idealism more ambiguous, remember that Kant called his philosophy transcendental idealism and empirical realism. And so even though, he allows for this transcendental domain, he claims, even though the phenomenal world is structured by the transcendental ego, he claimed that, because remember in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he actually adds an essay on refutation of idealism, where he's trying to show that because apparently people have been accusing him after the first time it was published, they were accusing him of being Berkeley, and saying, well, you're just like Berkeley, you're saying there's nothing but ideas. And he's like, no, I'm not Berkeley. There is empirical reality. It is, and phenomenal reality is empirical reality. Schelling is in this, but when he says things like, this is the end of the first paragraph on page, the very last thing I read, the end of the, no, never mind, not that. But there's some place where he calls idealism, oh, here it is, in the middle of 22. The idealist conception is true consecration for the higher philosophy over time, especially for its higher realism. So he's saying the idealist conception is some kind of higher realism. So I don't, that's another thing. I don't exactly know what he means by realism, given what Kant has said and what he's saying there.
So if I can make two comments. One thing I will say about Spinoza, because he's a pet interest of mine. You're right that, and I think this is what a lot of people at the time and still do, if you read into Spinoza a physicalist ontology, and in particular at the time, right, the physics that people are working on is Newtonian physics. So the assumption is okay, well, the way Newton describes the world is how the world works. And that's the kind of the like undergirding ontology that explains how like physical reality as we see it works. And you say, okay, well, if there is only a Newtonian physics, then obviously everything has to be deterministic because Newtonian physics is deterministic. Spinoza is very clearly rejecting that type of ontology. So even though Spinoza says that God and the natural world as we observe it are identical, he denies that the natural world as we see it is fundamentally Newtonian in that respect. So people make this distinction between like a physicalist monism versus an idealist monism, right? Everything is ideas, versus what is usually applied to Spinoza is called a neutral monism. So in this respect, I think Schelling gets it right, which is that Spinoza isn't committed to the idea that it has to necessarily be deterministic. Now, I do think that Spinoza, so he keeps using the phrase fatalism, and there is a subtle difference between fatalism and determinism, right, that we could plow into. I definitely do think that Spinoza is fatalist. Dual aspect neutral monism, not necessarily. With Spinoza, yeah, it's a dual aspect neutral monism. but like you can run with non-dual aspect neutral monisms, and I would still argue that it makes sense. So it's neutral because it's denying that the world is either resolvable into material reality or spirits or like ideas, or however we want to phrase that, right? What Spinoza would want to say is each of those things, right? So material reality as or reality as material and reality as ideas or spirit, or whatever phrase we're going to use for the other side of that dyad, both are emanations of a more essential reality, and that more essential reality is capable of existing as both possibilities, right? Or as both instantiations, effectively. The other thing that I wanted to say, and I mean I could blather about this all day, because again I just think Spinoza's neat. Where it's the Marge meme. But there's a phrase that he uses right at the end of the partial paragraph, or the first partial paragraph, I guess, because they're both partial paragraphs, on page 23, but it's the last sentence. But the real and the vital concept is that freedom is the capacity for good and evil. Now, maybe I shouldn't have, but I interpreted that as him providing us with a definition, right? He is telling us that, and I think this is very dialectical, and B, that this is also like a very Kantian way of approaching the question of what freedom is. He's not giving us a discrete definition. It might take him the whole book in the traditional way that we would expect, right? So he's not giving us a discrete definition in the sense that he says, freedom is the ability to act. What he's telling us is that freedom is whatever it is that explains why good and evil are possible. And yeah, we're going to have to do some philosophical investigation in order to figure out what that is. But I think that this turns the problem on its head, and I think it turns the problem on its head in an interesting way that's workable. And it's very Spinozist in that sense. But yeah, so that's me blathering about all that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think so. So yeah, he definitely wants to correlate freedom with the ability to do good and evil. Although I think he's still going to give a kind of detailed metaphysics or ontology, really, that's going to sort of give a theoretical grounding to it. And I think with that too, that's where the comment that Eric just made is going to tie in the sense that he's challenging the kind of thingness, the kind of static thingness of the, at least the way that Spinoza may have been, or at least was interpreted as having a kind of, static determinist sort of metaphysics. He's going to basically tweak that and make it dynamic, add some kind of like a vitalist principle, something animate and dynamic. And I think with that, he's going to try to explain how we can do good and evil, or maybe why it's necessary that we be able to do both those, good and evil, in order to explain freedom ultimately. At least that's the way I'm envisioning it.
I think what you were saying, Chase, is like the metaphysical aspect for me comes from, and like it seems like his issue with Kant is that Kant doesn't recognize that freedom is coming from or being like the world or nature or God, whereas he'll talk about this almost like self-revelation of God through like having to unfold through things that are like himself, and that like our freedom to do good and evil is kind of grounded in like an ontological being's freedom. And is that the same freedom that has the capacity to do good and evil, or is the capacity to do good and evil the freedom of man in particular? Maybe that's a question that I have. Where does it become like man's freedom versus like freedom in general? And I think like when he talks about idealists' concept of freedom, developing it into kind of like a general concept or a formal concept, like he mentions, it's just freedom in general, and it provides no guidance. And I think where he wants to find that guidance is in the question of good and evil, and kind of like bringing it back to theodicy. But that's how I see it plugging back into metaphysics, and that he's relating our capacity for good and evil to a more general freedom that for him is metaphysical. And it's kind of, yeah, is like grounded in nature, is grounded in the things in themselves. It's not just like a rational capacity that only man has that's for itself, which is, I think, what he, or at least my understanding of what he was saying, is Kant's idea of freedom.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Is he's mentioned a lot of those things kind of in passing, but hasn't gone into any detail about them. So yeah, the idea about God's self-revelation, I think, is going to be really important. In that, I think that's why he's going to say that they're so okay. So evil for him is, so he has this kind of distinction between the ground and existence, and freedom is a kind of separation, or at least this is the way I understand it. Human freedom is a kind of way of separating from the ground through existence, but then because of that, there's this possibility that there's an inversion of ground and existence, where I guess the kind of, I don't know, like moral orientation gets flipped, and then the sort of partial existence, or the kind of mode of existence, becomes the universal. So that's kind of like the danger that has to accompany the possibility of God's self-revelation to himself through that separation. So it's almost like a kind of like a fall narrative to a certain degree, where basically in order for God to, realize himself, he has to kind of separate from himself or differentiate from himself in some aspect, and then come to his own awareness through that kind of dialectical process of differentiation and recognition, or something like that. And that's going to give him that's going to lead to the necessity that there's a possibility of evil, of some kind of orientation flipping between the ground and the individual existences that are free. So at least that's my initial way of trying to see exactly what he's going to do there.
That kind of resonates with I feel like some of the stuff I was reading in the Heidegger commentary. He writes about kind of, and maybe to pair it with the Schelling, it seems that this would go in line with like what Kant does with his idealist concept of freedom. But Heidegger writes about like man liberating himself with like this kind of like mathematical system. And man liberates himself to think that like he is the genius who creates the world, or it kind of, and I think reminiscent of what was said in the introduction to our text about, I don't remember what he was referring to, but something about the justification for the conquest of nature, and like kind of thinking along the lines of like is the idealist conception of freedom that like reversal or perversion of values where evil is introduced is like what is allowing us to kind of turn against our mother, dominate, master, subjugate nature. And like, I guess, would he say that Kant's like reason freedom is kind of evil as opposed to good?
That I somehow kind of like missed that in the introduction, but that just blew my mind basically. Yeah. Okay, so that's what he was saying with, the whole sufficient reason thing with Leibniz, and I think especially Leibniz, but, Descartes, basically, where you have this, the de-worlded subject, the cogito, who stands over above the world of objects and determines them through this objectification, this mathematical superimposition of a grid structure. At least that's the way I see it. It's like putting things into this intellectual matrix and through that controlling it. And this is where I definitely think of Heidegger's kind of critique of technology as in framing nature. So it's basically you understand nature only as something that can be taken as a resource and extracted from. And now I can see, okay, so the idealist concept of freedom is basically this kind of intellectual ability to do that, to understand something so that you could act upon it in some degree. And then that's also, though, what gives this possibility of that inversion, of that evil. Yeah, that this is why we do this seminar, right? Just, yeah, somehow did not make that connection fully before. Hopefully other people realized what I was saying.
So how does that that over rationalization pave the way to a return to the ground, or to, you know, I haven't seen that. I'm not saying you're wrong. I just why is that?
It's like the question being why? What does this elevation of freedom? How does it help us? Is that kind of the question? Like, why is it? Because at least Schelling makes it sound like we needed to go through this phase so that we could return.
It sounds like, you know, the evil has something to do with returning to the ground. And then, I mean, maybe I've got this wrong, but it sounds like you guys were saying that. And then Chase was saying that this hyper-rationalization that you see in Descartes and Kant and so on somehow paves the way to that return to the ground or to evil. But maybe I'm misunderstanding you guys.
That almost reminds me too of like, how is at least the way we're thinking about it, is that not just like kind of reconciling evil as a kind of like good element in the progression? But yeah, I'm maybe hesitant on exactly how to answer it. Maybe it's just a good question. But I do recall reading somewhere about, you know, Schelling's idea that God's self-revelation involves like kind of like an othering of himself and falling away from that good. But yeah, I don't remember how does that not just fall back into the evil being, you know, a kind of good citizen?
Yeah, so the kind of Hegel's idea that they talk about. So, well, anyways, to answer that, I think the way that, you know, this hyper rationalization in which you basically enforce this kind of intellectual structure on something so that you can control it and extract it. So basically, water becomes H2O, you know, hydrogen and oxygen. Why? So that you can basically mine hydrogen and oxygen from it. Things become these aggregates of exactly what you want to take from them and extract from them and get the maximum energy from them for yourself, for humanity. And that's where the inversion of ground and existence becomes, because the existence of the human becomes the universal thing that, you know, whether it's technology or science or whatever, makes available to humans all of this energy. And that's where this partial thing, the humans, they become the universal for themselves. It all becomes about basically this self-aggregation of nature's energy for itself. And I think that's where it ties into that concept of evil as this inversion of the universal and I'm not sure what term he used, like maybe the singular, something like that.
I did find something in like an essay written by Worth on the treatise, and maybe Hunter will like this. He actually references the Khan. But he gives the analogy of a wound, talking about how like the perversion or the reversal is like helps with God's self-revelation or something. But he talks about like a wound is something that kind of like will isolate itself and draw all like attention and energy to itself as if it's the universal, like it's the problem. And this is what like exposes us to the idea of what it would mean to be healthy, like what it would mean not to have that wound. But at least he references Lacan here because he says that idea of health that we like gain a concept of in like the experience of a wound. He's like, that's something that we like never in the first place had, but it's something that's revealed to us through the wound. So it's like you kind of gain an appreciation and a consciousness of, I don't know if that would be the right way to phrase it, but a consciousness of like what you can do as a healthy person through the fact that you are now wounded. And so I think about how does the separation, how does the hyper rational idea of freedom like return us to what it would mean, what like real freedom is. But the kind of like self-revelation procession idea of it is that it's not something we ever like had in the first place that we're restoring. We're not like restoring health that we, you know, we don't start whole, but it's always kind of like developing, being revealed through like these falls, I guess.
So Joey, what that thing about the wound taking up so much attention makes me wonder then, and I mean, I'm really struggling to understand. I'm not, you know, I'm just trying to figure out what you guys are saying. So is the problem then, or a problem with the hyper rationalization of things, is that attracts all our attention in the sense of that becomes for us what reality is, you know, so that, you know, so like for example, Descartes explicitly says that the mathematical and geometric structure is the essence of material things. And, you know, that is what their essence is their mathematical and geometric structure. So what is essentially real is that, you know, that abstract mathematization. And then Kant, you know, by making the structure of the phenomenal world a function of the rational intellect, is he doing the same thing? And so is the problem, so like Chase was saying, Schelling, not a bad mistake. Schelling, if he's concerned about abstraction taking us away from the sort of concrete individual existence, then maybe part of the problem with the over-rationalization is that, like that wound, it draws our attention away from, from that concrete reality, and makes us start to believe that the reality is actually that abstraction, perhaps. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think when you say like drawn away from concrete reality, thinking like, you know, what is Schelling wanting you to think of that? And then I'm recalling how Chase was describing it, that like reversal or that perversion away from like the ground where the singular conceives of itself as the universal. So like Kant wants to be like, oh, look, human rationality, like that's what it's all about. Let's take freedom and subject it to human rationality. And like we then become separated from like what actually gives us freedom, because we're moving over to, like, so you could say a mode of freedom, like the humans, a capacity for freedom, or and turning that into a universal that then dominates over freedom. And in that way, we actually cut ourselves off from freedom. Because, you know, I guess that's kind of the Kantian thing. Are we really free if we're just supposed to follow reason versus the inclination? So yeah, I guess like kind of, yeah, what you're saying about Descartes and Kant saying the mathematical is the reality, the rational is what's real. I'm also recalling what Schelling says, maybe, let's see if I can find it on page like 18 or no, on page 22, yeah, when he's talking about Fichte's subjective idealism. So Fichte has the claims, the only reality is activity, life, and freedom, as if like the things that aren't those are like not real. And he says like I-hood is all. So like Schelling wants to say, instead of that, he should be also affirming the reversal of that, and that all reality, so like everything, is active, lively, and free. So it's not just like, oh, all the things out there, like those aren't real, only active freedom, only that stuff's real. It's like, no, everything that is real is free, active, and alive. And then he kind of like reverses it as well, saying, not only is I-hood all, but like all is I-hood. Kind of like, I think that's Schelling's attempt to turn us like, we can get this development in idealism, but we shouldn't stop with, so the rational is real. I feel like I'm having a hard time maybe differentiating it from Hegel here, but where he just starts to want to say like, well, no, everything that's real is rational, and there is a larger world, that's not just the human's phenomenal realm.
Yeah, I think especially now, it's one really concrete way to make sense of it is the whole fear of, ecological disaster and whatnot, in the sense that, okay, we've extracted all this energy from the planet, and now there's essentially a crisis in the ground of nature that, actually is what we're determinate upon. And I think that's a pretty good example of what he's kind of trying to talk about, although I'm not saying Schelling's an environmentalist or anything like that. But I think that's a good example of that kind of idea of a reversal. And also about this idea of, we treat nature, non-human nature, I mean, even human nature really, as something that isn't really a subject in its own right. And we ignore that aspect of it in order to, think about the way that if you say how people that are often persecuted against are given the status of being, less than human, that they're considered like Untermensch or subhuman or something like that. And that's usually kind of paves the way for people to be basically persecuted and whatnot. I think that's a good example of something, as well as the idea that this nature is really just, extended matter that we can extract for energy, and that's all it is. And therefore, we can use this. And instead, he's saying, and that line about the reversal of the I-hood and all, I was looking for that line earlier, is I think that's a really good example of, Fichte has this kind of thing that, not quite sure if it's solipsism, but he's saying, the I-hood is all. And he's saying, instead, we do need, that's okay as long as you understand that the all is I-hood, that basically everything also has an interiority and a in itself of existing, that it exists in a way that our, mathematical superimposition of a conceptual grid on it does not fully determine it. There's that remainder that still is there. And yeah, we have to, so Nevin, you asked the question earlier, is that all that we see from reality when we impose this on it, so I'm not exactly sure what Schelling would say, but I know Heidegger definitely would say yes. He basically says that that's one of the biggest problems, is that being is no longer open to questioning. It becomes something obvious. It's just, extended matter just sitting out there, nothing going on there. Instead, he's saying basically we need to see that there's some kind of just inherent weirdness and kind of mystery to being that can never be fully revealed. There's always going to be some kind of absence along with a revelation. It's always going to conceal as well as reveal. And, it's really easy to see a lot of Heidegger in this because, of course, he looks like he got a lot from Schelling. But, yeah, hopefully that comparison helps.
I also don't really know. Yeah, I've been reading some companion texts to this, like some commentary from Zizek that we were thinking about getting earlier. And his conception of Schelling is just really wacky in certain areas. He has some really crazy ideas as to what Schelling believes, and I'm excited to see if they're true. But I'd like to kind of comment on two things. First, the thing about the Hegelian idea of a loss of something creating the dimension which was lost, and so the thing that you lost is just sort of a specter that was never really there until you lost something, and then the lost dimension was created as a result of that loss. That's Hegel talks about, and that's called the absolute recoil. And there's some biblical quote or something that he talks about like the only thing that can heal my wounds is the spear that smote the wound itself. And I think that that wound that we're talking about, that wound that drives our attention, I think that wound is really important and really present in, or at least it was present in the commentaries that I got from Zizek. I can't read that. Oh, hey. It's a coincidence.
It's actually a different Bible verse, but I just thought it was funny that I have a Bible verse here.
I also think it's funny. So
Continue, please.
It's okay. I shall. I think that there's this thing that, by the way, I hope this trombone is not the most obnoxious thing in the world that's going on, but I think that there's this tendency in Schelling towards what I think is kind of present in Kantian thought, even to some degree, but with the world of the noumenal. But I think that Schelling kind of puts forward an idea that is something like it's something like a realism. It's like how people conceive of realism with this dimension of materiality to things that basically is divorced from form. At least like by the analysis of Zizek, the approach of this, okay, the way we described it earlier, material reality being full on absolute, internal, super zoomed in investigation. We find this realm of obscene vitality, this unpredictable kind of soup of the sensuous manifold, the metaphysical substrate that is obscene vitality. There's a scene in Blue Velvet that's very similar to this idea, or that I think illustrates this idea really well. At the very beginning, when the guy's in his lawn mowing the grass, and then he gets like an attack of some kind and falls down, and then a dog starts biting at him while he's on the ground having a seizure, and then the camera zooms very far into some grass, and you see a million very small, horrible-looking little insects in a dark hole in the ground, and then it disappears, and that's the end of the scene. It never comes back, and it's never referenced again. And I think it, in a way, illustrates at least this notion of, or at least the approach that I think is put forward in this idea of having obscene vitality as a dimension of materiality which is divorced from form. But Zizek puts forward something, and I'm just bringing this up because we mentioned wound. I think it's interesting, and it might be an interesting idea. It's something that's coloring my thoughts for sure. But it's the idea of leaning into this wound. There's basically Zizek argues in favor of a materialism, which is implied on the disappearance of matter. Like we keep talking about, there's got to be some sort of substantial matter out there that we can count on that is outside of our grasp or whatever. But this materialism is not based on that. It's a materialism without matter as a substance. It's materialism that's purely formal and based on waves and quanta in a dematerialized space. It specifically in a sort of dialectically materialist space. But this materialism, this purely formal materialism, is really similar to what you were talking about with Descartes. And that's what I was really thinking about, was like, I don't think it's really similar, but I think it reminds me very heavily, as you talk about it, of the, like, and then Kant saying we've got to put it in terms of this formula and this rationale and these mathematical existences of material. But I think that this purely formal materialism is still a materialism in a way, in the sense that, and this, if you push me too hard, I'll get scared and I won't be able to explain every nook and cranny. But it's such that the movement of immateriality is totally contingent and purposeless, and therefore the immaterial is not this infinite depth of obscene vitality within things, like this force, this vitality to things, which I think Schelling is arguing in favor of. I'll be clear. It's not an infinite depth of obscene vitality, but it's a totally non-spiritual, contingent surge of movement, and this contingency should be embraced, and it causes sort of a letting go or an abandonment of senses of evolution and development and progression and things like that, which I think a lot of people accuse Hegel of. But yeah, I think it's something like that.
Hunter, are you saying that last part was a criticism that Zizek?
Yeah, it's like
Schelling?
Yeah, well, it's like I mean, his criticism of Schelling is very weird. Like, it's short, but yeah, he critiques Schelling's idea of the obscene vitality, and then he offers up his alternative idea, and that's coloring my thinking. But he said something really crazy at the beginning. I'm reading this book by him called Sex and the Failed Absolute, and there's this really crazy part at the very beginning where he said, it's brief, but he says, Schelling moves from the logic of reality to the real of primordial drives, the capital R real, of primordial drives within people, into this abyss of freedom that we contain within ourselves. And Zizek describes this as a move from logos, the logic of reality and material, to mythos. And that this asserts, and apparently in some of Schelling's work, asserts a notion of the feminine. And then Schelling apparently takes this notion of the feminine to the end and conceives of the female orgasm as the high point of human evolution. And through it, humans come into contact with the absolute. And this was Schelling's break from pure idealism into the bodily sphere, into the experiential bodily phenomenological sphere. And I have no idea if that's true or not, but I'm excited to find out.
I feel like at least some of that is Zizek just fucking with his readers. Like, I'm not. I think the ideological thrust of what he just said there makes a lot of sense to me, particularly in terms of like what I said last time in terms of Schelling being a kind of intermediate, transitional form between Kant and Nietzsche, right? To move from a kind of idealism to a kind of struggling with forces. I mean, arguably, with respect to that, I would point out mechanically, the orgasm doesn't do anything. It's unnecessary. It's like a pure welling up of enjoyment that doesn't have anything to do with a materialist obsession with reproduction, for instance. So I don't even know if that's a good way of discussing it. But anyways.
I watched, I had those videos that Chase, you sent me on Lacan, like in my video YouTube queue for the longest time. And he's just like one of those people. I'm just like, will I ever get around to getting into him as much as I would like to? But I did watch those videos the other day, and
Nice.
my Lacan interest is kick-started. I have like 10 cute podcasts in my lists. And I'm like, what's the connection? Where do we direct the flow into Lacan? How does that happen from
Yeah.
Schelling?
So I have some questions that I think Hunter, you can kind of go off of this. So like the whole obscene vitality thing. Uh, is that so basically, you have this obscene vitality or like this like bare materiality, which is basically, that's the real of Lacan. So Lacan has, this idea of the three registers, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. And the real is something that, can't be represented. It can't be put into a symbol system, and it kind of erupts into uh, I don't know what you call it, like presencing or whatnot into reality. I guess there's a distinction between the real with a capital R and reality. And is that something like that obscene vitality, and is that something that is like Schelling's idea of this dark ground coming into existence? Or is it more the principle of the dark ground that it would be, or is it this, this kind of dialectic of the self-revelation of, the ground and the existence? I'm not exactly sure, basically where the comparison would be in terms of trying to translate, kind of like Lacan, Zizek, and all that into like Schelling's kind of system. Yeah, so I guess that's my question.
I want to start by saying that I think there's a point where I think Lacan comes in, and because he comes into everything. But I'm not just trying to like pull a scarf out of my sleeve. I'm like, I swear to God, there's real, so there's some level of thought that goes into this, but I think basically um, that if we look at like let's say that Schelling does go on this sort of into this realm of the feminine, and he asserts it as sort of an ontological proof of God or a contact with the absolute. uh, I think that this dimension of the notion of the feminine and the realm of the mythos and the primordial drive, it is in a sense it's not focused on the right area of the problem. And I think that the right area of the problem to be focused on is a dimension of the wound that we've been talking about this whole time, this gap or this failure or this antagonism that's present, not only in my ability to perform or to create a structure of forms or formalities by which reality exists, and therefore the gap in my ability to produce the very forms that caused reality to exist vis-a-vis forms causes an openness in that reality and therefore a chance for freedom and contingency. But it also exists in the dimension of antagonisms, gaps, and failures in things like sexuality. Now, I think that this that's kind of the problem, and that's kind of physics problem with looking at a like cosmology in this kind of weirdly pseudo like sexualized way, like yin and yang, man and woman, light and dark. There's a real problem with that. But the focus should be more on this gap or this distance or this failure in my ability to provide the forms by which material represents itself or by which material exists, and that opens up a space for legitimate freedom. If we agree on this notion of materialism as materia as forms, but I think that the place where it gets a little confusing is where Lacan jumps in, and Lacan, I think, enters the frame as saying that sexual difference, if sexual difference is to exist at all, and this is Lacan's, I think, kind of radical, very feminist, and this is where Judith Butler, I think, comes from a lot. This very feminist argument of Lacan's, which is that, like, it's like when we're trying to talk about what is feminine and what is masculine, or what are these sexualities or these sexual orientations or whatever. His basic question is to say no. Well, like what? Let's stop trying to ask what are these things really, right? And let's look at the very way that we're organizing the problem and consider maybe that's the problem. Maybe that's problematic. Maybe that's holding us back. Maybe we are trying to say something else. We're trying to say something that we're not saying by saying, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a real woman? Yeah, it's like Foucault, very much so. I agree. It's what are we trying to say with man and woman? And Lacan, but here's the thing. I think that Foucault, my only apprehension towards Foucault, towards digging deep into Foucault, like Joe was talking about with Lacan, is that I think that Foucault definitely explicates and really well organizes an argument around this. Like, let's zoom out, let's look at the problem, let's look at how we're asking it, let's say, what are both options holding as presuppositions? If I say yes, if I say no, what do both agree on? Foucault's very good at that. But I think Lacan takes it, and this is is a neophyte, so please, a grain of salt, a pound of salt for me. But I think that Lacan would say that he takes it a step further. And he gives this answer. He says, we're trying to talk about pure difference. This Lacanian notion of pure difference. When he says that masculine and feminine exist as anything, if we're going to talk about them in any real way at all, if we're going to have any sort of productive conversation as to what these concepts are, effectively in our experience, it's in pure difference. It's in things like universality and particularity, right? And my thing is that I think this is where Hegel kind of jumps in and gives this openness to that pure difference. It gives it a failure to that sexuality, to that pure difference. And it creates a dialectical relationship between universality and particularity, where universality is always thwarted by the particular, which is always embedded in the universal, and so on. You know, I think that there's sort of a line of progression that's going in that direction, but I don't really know where it's going. But to answer your question, Chase, I think that Lacan was like a hardcore relativist, right? And I mean, God, I know there are some people who like Lacan who, if they're one of the 3 people who watch this video, I'll get like bombed. But I think that Lacan was a relativist, and I think that his conception of the real, as far as I'm aware, if we can talk about his conception of the obscene vitality or the real, or the, like, to talk like you're regarding this fathomless, fathomless dark emptiness or whatever, this kind of void. I think that Lacan, that void is object small a, in a sense. It's this thing within the realm of pure self-reflection. It's a negative thing. It's a purely negative thing. It's a void. But the real, as far as Lacan's conception has confronted me, and now I'm not an expert on Lacan's real, and I don't know much. There's probably a lot to the real I am totally oblivious of. But what I do know about the real is that it's relative. The relative in the sense that the real is whatever I'm not looking at. Fantasy exists relative to the real in the sense that the real is the excess of the fantasy, always. The Lacanian real is the excess of the fantasy. And what that means is that whenever I approach something, I approach it with a phantasmatic frame. It's not like a silk screen over my approach to brute reality, but it's like a frame within which I approach those material or that reality. I approach it in this frame, this phantasmatic one, and then I escape from the misery of my reality into this phantasmatic approach, and then that phantasmatic approach becomes my miserable reality, and then I escape from that into another fantasy, and so on and so on. I'm always jumping into fantasies. It's like I'm in a boat in the ocean, and I'm crafting a boat with my bare hands, like, or a raft out of planks and wood, and it's just barely okay enough to keep me steady, and I jump onto it, and then I have to go around and fix the boat I just jumped out of and get all the water out and make sure it floats, and oh my God, you know? And then I have to jump back into that one before this one that I'm on sinks due to my weight. And I'm just caught, and the ocean is the real, you know? And I don't think that that's like an obscene vitality necessarily, but I don't know what it is. And so I have no authority. And that's the end of it.
So I guess it could be, it's something like the universal or the ground is something because it's kind of, something that's so much in excess. I think he's scooping like, what is that? Some kind of food out. Joey is inverting the ground and existence. Yeah. I feel like there's some jouissance going on there. Okay, so anyways, what was I saying? Oh yeah, so the universal is this ground, that can't be represented as the real and all these things. Then, I don't even have the will to make my point anymore. I'm just going to stop right there.
I'm afraid this analogy, or maybe way off, because I have not read any Schelling before, and I don't really know what he means by ground, but I have this image in my mind of Plato's receptacle in the Timaeus. And so, when he tells this creation story, he says, I haven't read it in a long time, so I may get parts of it wrong, but you have the receptacle as this is pure chaos, pure unformed chaos. There are no things there because it's just stuff. It's like material static. And then the demiurge looks at the beautiful domain of the forms and all that nice order, and then the demiurge begins to try to shape that chaos into objects patterned after the forms, and that's how we get this phenomenal world. So the underlying metaphysical stuff of the phenomenal world is this chaos, which is why the forms can never hold any particular object in a stable structure for very long, because the underlying chaos is always trying to fall apart. And so the notion, and again, I may be completely off, but I get this sense of the ground maybe being something like this. I mean, part of what I'm doing is riffing on the phrase that Hunter had, the whatever that was, the living, whatever.
The obscene vitality comment?
There you go.
The obscene vitality, which that is an awesome phrase.
Yeah, and so I think like the underlying ontological whatever is this sort of chaotic, but this chaotic powerhouse, something like that. And so you've got this the sort of source of all energy and power, but it's unstructured, and then you have things that I'm not suggesting at all that Schelling is suggesting a Platonic kind of thing, but and I don't know, maybe this is what God does, I don't know, but that then things emerge from that somehow, and from that ground. So it's like you've got to have that, because that's where all the vitality and power is, and then things become sort of shaped vitality and power. And so, wow, my screen just did something weird. And so, I don't know what my computer's doing. All right, can you?
You're coming through fine for us.
Yeah, we can still hear you.
Actually, now you're roboting.
Okay. Oh, my computer's complaining about some app is trying to take over my computer, which is just scary.
Hello, yes. Would you give us all your credit card details and also your social security number?
No. But anyway, so I'll try to make it quick. So then, because I think Schelling, I don't think Schelling wants to come out, I think he wants to avoid this clear good and evil thing, that's been the tradition. On the other hand, like Joey said, he wants to avoid making evil into a good citizen. And so it's hard to figure out how to do that. But maybe part of what that means is that what evil is sort of a return to that unstructured vitality, which isn't evil in the, I don't know, isn't evil in the traditional sense, but it's evil in the sense that it breaks down the structure of the world or something. But that's all speculation. I'm going to go try to figure out what the hell my computer's doing.
So the one thing that I would specifically say that, because I think the analogy that you're referencing in Plato is somewhat close, at least to how Spinoza would talk about this, and it is close to what the sense I get that that Schelling would also be interested in it. The one thing that Spinoza is definitely going to deny is a fundamental dualism, where you divide the world into saying, okay, there is the chaos stuff, and then there's the demiurge forming it. He's going to say there's just one thing, and that one thing is the demiurge and the chaos simultaneously, or it plays both of those rules simultaneously. So insofar, because one thing that would become concerning about that in terms of what Schelling is setting up is that if you're saying that there's a fundamental ground that it is like that chaos, and it wants to sort of just kind of well up and be this destructive, unstructured force, then it seems as though it's a citizen, right? Like it's a fundamental citizen of this program. I think the way that Schelling is going to get around this, or this is my intuition, is that he's going to say evil is a kind of structural possibility that is present whenever there is whenever there is existence, right? Is it can always fall into whatever evil is. It can also always fall into whatever good is. So evil isn't going to be a separate substance or thing or a part of a dyad. It's always going to be something that is going to be a possibility, and I could pull out some sort of Rick Roderick / Kierkegaard reference here to say, okay, well, if it's structurally possible, then that means it's necessary, right? It's going to happen because it's always a possibility that can be spat out of the system, like as an inevitability, effectively. All hearts in the comments for Rick Roderick. But other than that, yeah, I mean, I do think that there is something to this idea. The way that I had Spinoza described to me when I was first taught him by why is my brain blanking on his name? I feel really guilty now. In the Texas State Philosophy Department.
Marquez.
Not Marquez. Marquez was not the one that taught me this.
He's on a Delusian podcast that I found.
Oh,
yeah,
wait, is it God, it has schizoid somewhere in the title.
Yeah, he was on some episode that I randomly found.
No, yeah, he actually shared that with me when he first did it. And Barcenas. Wow. Thank you. Yes, Barcenas. Barcenas is the one who first
oh, yeah.
My brain was totally breaking on his name, and I feel really guilty. But yeah, the way that the analogy that he gave me was God is, and therefore nature, and therefore everything, is like a pot of water that's on a burner. And it just bubbles. And there's just stuff that's happening. But that bubbling isn't fundamentally destructive or unstructured. Like that bubbling is the structuring nature of reality. It's how reality becomes things that we see, because the fundamental force that it stands behind things coming into existence is that bubbling, if that makes sense.
And then is the heat the life? You know, like in other words, if you take the heat out, then you just get a flat, you know,
So
bowl of
so
water.
part of the problem with the analogy, and this is something that I came to realize afterwards, is that the analogy does assume that there's this distinction. For Spinoza, the universe just bubbles because it bubbles. There's no heat. I mean, there's heat in the sense that like you can sense that heat because there is a kind of a vitality, but the bubbling is just there. It's just constant. It's the fundamental nature of reality is that it bubbles.
I guess that could be compared with the Spinoza says that substance is causa sui, a cause of its own. Um, so I guess to stretch the metaphor beyond what it's supposed to do, I guess, but it would be that the water itself is kind of producing its own heat, which can then bubble itself into oblivion in some way. I kind of like this though because it has a kind of dynamic character to it, with the idea of you know the boiling leads to its own kind of evaporation. But that reminds me of the thing that Schelling was talking about with uh, Spinoza was that so he called it some kind of a vague formulation or something like that. I have no idea where in the reading it is, but he says that the modes have a kind of eternal existence themselves in some way. Um, I kind of agree with Schelling that it's kind of vague, I guess, but I wonder if that has to do with just the way that uh, Spinoza is too static for Schelling, that he wants to. So he says that the ground is eternal, but there's obviously some kind of a dynamic temporal element going on for Schelling. So I wonder if that's kind of where he's really trying to do something different from Spinoza, is instead of where Spinoza, I think it makes sense that the infinite substance is eternal, and then the modes are temporal, and that's why we're both confused, my buddy Schelling and I, about what Spinoza's talking about by saying that the modes are eternal too. And that's why Schelling and me are, we're such good friends that we're going to agree also that, yeah, there needs to be some kind of a dynamic element going on here.
So I guess kind of in agreement with the first half of what Chase has said. So my the dumb version, the dumb apologist version of this that my brain likes to use is to just totally appropriate Aristotle's first mover argument, right? So the whole thing is centered around this idea of like, okay, well, you need some sort of explanation of how it is that material the material world as we see it moves, because things are either fundamentally movers themselves, or something has to push them into motion. And so Spinoza's answer to that, his cheeky version of it, is just to say everything is an unmoved mover. Literally everything is an unmoved mover. So the second half of what you said, I was going to kind of come to Spinoza's defense to a certain extent against your and Schelling's concerns, and I was going to say Spinoza is his. I don't quite like. This is why I like hesitated when because he does think that there are these two different modes of God, right, or of the pantheistic ground of being, and I think that he's wrong to divide it into two and to limit it into two. I think that's a mistake that Spinoza makes. But that being said, the modes are eternal for the same reason that Nietzsche has to posit an eternal return, right? Like there are like the thing is an unmoved mover, and things are constantly welling up into existence, which means that constantly temporal things are basically it's rational, and I forget what the other dyad of the mode is, but yeah, he posits essentially a material mode and a rational mode, and those two things are expressions of God. They're modes in which they can appear, and right, they appear in different respects to different entities, right? So what it means in this person is different from that person, which is different from how we talk about it in people versus animals versus the natural world as a whole, and blah 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 blah. But so things are eternal. Aren't modes and attributes the same thing, or am I mistaken?
I thought it was substances. Okay, so there's substance, which is the independent, substrate, and then the attributes were kind of the quality of it, the properties of it, which I think for Spinoza is, thought and extension. And then I believe the modes are kind of like the individual kind of expressions of it that have
No,
the
that makes
attributes,
sense.
I think.
Sorry, I was definitely getting the terminology mixed up. But yeah, that what you just said, I'm pretty sure is correct. Ultimately, right,
Okay.
the modes are mixtures of the attributes, and the attributes are facets of the whole of God, right? I forget what I was saying before this now.
Yeah, well, sorry. Okay, so, but yeah, what you're saying earlier actually made sense to me about why he would consider the modes. Well, I guess especially if you consider them, the attributes, why that would be considered eternal for Spinoza. But even the idea of the modes as a formal reality would make sense because like we just spelled it out. The substance, attributes, and modes. That's formally it's staying the same, even if the individual modes themselves are somewhat limited in their duration. It definitely makes sense that at least those attributes of thinking or rationality or whatnot, and then the extension and causality and all that as well, that they each have a kind of eternal form, I guess, within substance. And even, Whitehead says something kind of similar by saying that, what makes things temporal and in a process still have a kind of, timeless dimension to them. And that's what allows them to have some kind of, flow through time. It's kind of like the cliche saying of, the only constant is change. There you have, change is, the reality of this sense, but it's constantly occurring. So therefore it has a formal kind of persistence that you could, I guess, at least in, Spinozan talk would be eternal. So Schelling is dumb. Why can't he get that? We should just stop reading this book.
No, go ahead.
I was just like, that was kind of my reaction when I was reading it. I was just like, Schelling, no, this is simple. Why aren't you getting this? But to be fair, I have the benefit of Nietzsche, whereas Schelling does not. So because I think you just say the phrase eternal recurrence, and you're like, oh, okay, I get it. But anyway, sorry, Nevitt, go for it.
Anyone watching the TV show Dark? I think
Ooh,
physics
yeah.
probably
Yeah.
the physics is probably shit, but
Oh no, my internet.
the story's interesting. Anyway, Nietzsche shows up there in eternal recurrence occasionally, but That had nothing to do with Schelling, as far as I know. You just said eternal recurrence, and all of a sudden dark popped in my mind. I was looking at page 20 in Schelling when he's talking about Spinoza, and maybe that's when he begins to talk about Spinoza, and he goes on for a couple of pages. And I'm not sure, is this what you guys are complaining about? So in that paragraph, the first full paragraph, a couple sentences down, Spinoza therefore must be a fatalist for a completely different reason, one independent of pantheism. The error, so that, and I think maybe Eric was referring to this, the error of his system lies by no means in his placing things in God, but in the fact that they are things. In the abstract concept of beings and in the world, indeed, of infinite substance. Anyway, then God is also a thing. So is your complaint that Schelling doesn't understand what it means to be a mode, and that a mode is not a thing? Is that?
No, so I was referring to a different part. Let's see if I can find it. So it says something like Spinoza says a few vague things that we can't really discern, and one of them has to do with the eternal nature of modes. Although, to go along with Schelling's kind of overall sort of critique of Spinoza, I think that's kind of the heart of it, is that line there, to a certain degree, is this idea of the thingliness of the things that are in God. But the part at the very beginning, when he's talking about Spinoza and what's really kind of before then, when he's talking about the copula and the propositions and all that stuff, that was definitely difficult for me. This is kind of the part towards the beginning when he's talking about, the is of identity and how people constantly see this in a naive sense. And I think the way that he first compares that to Spinoza was really confusing to me. But yeah, I guess I should actually find the passage I'm referring to before I start talking about this. So please, talk amongst yourselves.
My conception of that is that he was kind of like talking about like pantheism and like how people say God is nature. He's saying like the is not to be understood as identity, but it's a kind of procession, a self-revealing, a kind of enfolding, unfolding. The subject precedes, the predicate follows. I'm like trying to trace my line of thinking to like what he was really getting at with Spinoza. I think he was getting at like why people have misunderstood Spinoza.
Joey, were you reading from a particular page number there, or were you just from memory?
I could probably find the page number.
I think it's like page 13-ish.
Yeah, and he goes on like to page 17. So yeah, I think 13 is where he first brings it up, and I see it even talking about 17, where he gets into talking about containment as well and dependence. And I think that's kind of like directly related to the copula stuff.
I mean, really, on page 13, in a really simple sense, he in the middle of the page he talks about the copula, and then he says the is not always simple identity. So, for example, the body is blue does not have the meaning that the body is in and through that, and through which it is a body also blue. So it's not like blue and body are the same thing. It's an adjective. And as a general thing, I'm wondering if he's just suggesting that because we use is in a variety of ways, we get our metaphysics gets confused because we think we're talking in one mode when actually we should be talking in the mode of is, we're using it one way when actually we should be using it in a different way. And because of that, so I don't even know, maybe like, to say the world is God or something, maybe even that could be problematic because we're not quite sure what kind of is we're talking about there.
And maybe he means to be highlighting the idea that by saying that God is nature is not to limit God to nature, but like nature is contained within God, but God is still capable of being like outside or a precedent to nature. I feel like he has some portion that I wouldn't know where to find, but he uses the words like, we can't think of like nature as adding everything up in nature. Like we can't think of this as if it would amount to God. I feel like that's him trying to detach the idea that pantheism necessitates kind of determinism or a non-freedom.
I also think it links back to the discussion we were having about Heidegger, right, in the question concerning technology. There's a difference between conceiving of nature as just the accumulation of all the logs and the right, all of the things that would be part of a sort of calculative reason, rationalized dissembling of nature into its deterministic pieces, and of approaching nature and conceiving of nature as this biologically vital thing, or not even necessarily biologically, but just this fundamentally vital thing that can act and has a sort of being to it, and the way that we interact with it and treat it can fundamentally destroy it by dismembering it in certain kinds of ways.
So to kind of go off what Eric just wrote, I think that helps, especially with the idea that he has about Fichte, that the I-ness is all. Well, we also need the all to have I-ness as well. We need to have, and that's the principle of realism that he's talking about, in the sense that even that universal that's out there, that's nature, that obscene vitalism, it also needs to be kind of recognized and given some kind of substantial recognition, even if we can't put it into our particular grid. And so what he's saying with evil, and with the whole Heidegger thing, is it would be taking those particulars and just saying that is all there is to it. There is no universal beyond that. Just however we understand it as a way of kind of gathering it together, that would be all there is to something. There's no principle of realism there. It all becomes the idealism of kind of applying a conceptual grid to something. And that's why I see a lot of certain interpretations, I guess, of science, especially like a kind of, scientism. It has a real idealist flavor to it, and that these people take, abstract models, mathematical models as, the ultimate reality, and then experience and all these things are given, well, that can be illusory. And it's given this kind of secondary status to the abstract mathematical model itself, where you have to have these isolated experiments that, there's never any like a real vacuum in the way that Newtonian physics would like there to be. But yet, how many people believe that is reality? The math tells the reality, but, the irreducible kind of just sensation and being of all these things interacting with each other, that will never be completely put into some kind of a grid or an equation or a theory. There's always going to be some kind of remainder for that. And that's also where I think you can find that universal, maybe in Hegelian terms or whatnot, but also that, I guess in Heideggerian terms, that would be like the weirdness of being there that can't be fully revealed by anything. It's just going to have a history of concealing and revealing itself. And that's also where Schelling is going to get this. Well, Schelling's not getting it from Heidegger, obviously. But you see the similarity there with this idea of revealing and concealing. I think that's going to be something like this revelation and concealment of the divine and the between this dialectic of like the universal and the particular and whatnot, that is going to be part of his whole thing. Yeah.
Both got gun shy. Sorry, but yeah, Nevin and I unmuted at the same time. We both got awkward and backed out. But I took the
It's because
stand.
my outros are so weird. I don't know how to talk. I'm probably autistic. Sorry.
Yeah, it's your fault. It's entirely your fault. But we can forgive that for now. The council has decided to let you live, so long as I can prattle on. So I'm interested here. I'm interested here when talking about the is or the copula. Right? I think there's something that is interesting about Schelling's idealism. I think that something that's really interesting to me about Schelling's idealism, and I want to know if maybe this intersects, or maybe this is kind of a part, like, or maybe this thing I find weird about the way he thinks, maybe that in a way motivates his critiques on the eternal nature of modes. And that's my question. So, but here, let me explicate. So I'm familiar with an idealism that's like different than Schelling's notion of idealism in terms of subject, predicate, and the is. The idealism that I'm very familiar with is based around speculative thinking. And speculative thinking is like a process or an act which makes the predicate of a statement with a subject and a predicate. The predicate becomes the substance or the subjectum. So subject passes into predicate and then is sublimated in a way, which I can say that in a normal way. Basically, that means that when I say the predicate, the predicate forces us to go back to the subject. The subjectum taken as firm foundation is kind of abandoned, and since thought does not think something else in the predicate, but rather kind of rediscovers the subject itself within that predicate of that subject. This is something that explains why it's kind of close to scientism, or to not to scientism, but to sort of like a thing that modern scientists could agree with. Is because this way of doing philosophical statements, they're like representative. Let's call normal people who aren't freaks like us think in a normal, healthy, representative way, and they take the things that I say or the things that come from this brand of idealism. This is Gadamer, by the way, I'm pulling from this brand of idealism. The philosophical statements are always something like a tautology, where the philosophical statement just expresses an identity. And in it, the supposed difference between subject and predicate is like, it's not they're transcended. They're really fully transcended. And that means that the philosophical statement, what I was getting at earlier, is is not really like a statement. There's nothing posited that is supposed to remain or to be checkable. Because the is or the verifiable against something out there. Because the is or the copula of the statement has entirely different function in this version of idealism than I think Schelling's idealism. And that's, can I give a specific example? I may. It's the copula, or the is, does not state the being of something using something else. Like, the body is blue. The body is blue. I'm not using blue to state the being of the body or to describe the being of the body, but rather I'm describing the movement in which thought passes over from the subject into the predicate in order to find some firm ground, some guarantee. I think that it's that's like it's like a hardcore idealism. I know, and I don't really know how I haven't taken it to the end necessarily, but I know that that's the core of dialectical speculation, is this idea that we are constantly working towards an identity, and we're not trying to state the being of something using something else. Like, the body is blue, where blue is not necessarily the body, and the body is not blue insofar as it is a body in itself, but it just happens to be blue. It happens to have a blue determination. I think that Hegel would say that we're not doing that. Rather, we are just describing the movement in which thought passes over the subject and predicate in order to find firm ground, as we shift our position towards this object. And I don't even know how Hegel feels about objects. I'm such a dummy, but I know that there's something in a dematerialized space that we relate to and that we have a mediated relationship to. Our relationship is wholly mediated. And I think that in that mediation, there is thought moving around, in a sense. And I think that's the idealism. And so my thing is that's kind of one of my first big problems with Schelling, is like, what do you mean? Like, with this, about like, what kind of idealism is he running on? Because I know it's not Hegelian, and it doesn't have to be. I'm not a dictator. But, like, his is, or his version of the is, seems to be causing him some problems. It seems like he's kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. Like he's in this weird middle ground where, like, he's trying to, like Sean, you said earlier, he's trying to, or he's not trying to, but he is like an embodiment or an engendering of this progress from an idealism into like a Nietzsche, into like a something like that, this bodily sphere or something, Heidegger and so on. But he's caught in like a weird place. He's like in a weird middle ground.
Perhaps like a idealism into a phenomenology. I'm just speculating.
You're not allowed to speculate. Only hardcore facts here.
This is the fact zone. By the way, guys, so sorry. I have to leave a little bit early because I have another Zoom session. So, and I need to pick up some food in between then and now. But I want to.
Are you cheating on us?
Yeah. With another book club group. It's not a book club, but whatever. But yeah, take care, guys.
All right, see you.
Okay, go polygamist. One thing I was this kind of moves in a different direction, but actually it's related to the phenomenology comment, I guess. Back toward the end of our reading section, again on page 22, when he's talking about Fichte, I think Chase or someone read this earlier, like a fourth of the way down. He says, not only is, Fichte's got his self-positing I, which is the ground of reality and the basis of everything. And I guess part of the reason he does that is because then that founds reality on the freedom of the I. So it's supposed to produce this sort of robust freedom. But then Schelling says, not only is I-hood all, but also the reverse, the all is I-hood. And so because you guys keep talking about Deleuze and other people like that, I keep thinking about the tension between phenomenology, or at least some of its early manifestations, and some of these movements like Deleuze and so on, where, people like and Sartre especially, those guys tend to say, well, you've got to start from, and maybe this is related to what Alex was asking earlier about subjectivity, but you've got to start with the immediacy of the subjective awareness. And that's where your ontology has to start, because that's what I know most clearly are the sort of facts of my subjective experience. But then, you know, some of these other movements, which you guys know a lot better than I do, want to posit, I mean, even, you know, Whitehead, for example, wants to posit that that subjectivity emerges from something else. And so he sort of decenters subjectivity. And I gather that Deleuze does that as well. And so, you know, when I hear Schelling say that, not only is I-hood all, but also the reverse, that all is I-hood, I'm curious as to kind of where Schelling is. I mean, I think, you know, maybe we'll find out. I'm not saying that we can figure it out from here, but that is you know, that polarity is sort of, my mind is always messing with that because of, you know, these shifts we've been making between phenomenology and these other, you know, like process philosophies and so on. So, I'm curious as to whether, you know, if Schelling's gonna have some kind of pantheism of some sort, or even gonna in general make some sort of deity the ground of reality, then that again seems to be one of those types of ontologies that is unlike phenomenology, and that it is sort of decentering subjectivity in some way. So I guess I'm sort of echoing Alex's question way back when. I'm curious, you know, what role subjectivity plays in all of this.
So I'm not sure I can exactly answer that in terms of what Schelling is going to say, but at least I can say, I guess I could give an account of why that subjectivity would not necessarily be kind of the only principle, maybe, and maybe from there we can get something, extrapolate something about Schelling, but at least in the way that, so maybe I'm kind of misunderstanding, but so you're kind of saying that that subjectivity is kind of epistemologically primary, that's what we know first of all more than anything, kind of like, you know, Descartes, and then from there we can extrapolate out maybe to, you know, an objective existence of some type.
Well, I think, I mean, you know, Husserl and also Sartre, they explicitly say that they are Cartesian in the sense of that starting from subjectivity, but unlike Descartes, they don't posit a duality between a sharp duality between subjective consciousness and objective world. And I take it that that's, at least in Husserl, that is one of the profound movements of phenomenology, is to try to undercut that distinction between subject and object by saying that subjectivity and objectivity, I mean, I want to use the word dialectical, but I feel like that's probably not the right word to use, but there's some sort of co-determinacy between subjectivity and objectivity. So it's not like Descartes, where you've got a subjective consciousness and an objective world, but that somehow subjectivity and objectivity are co-constitutive. And then, you know, with Heidegger, rather than consciousness, that becomes Dasein, you know, that which experiences the world, and the world becomes sort of co-constitutive. And but in both of those cases, you know, we have to start. It's not merely I mean, it is an epistemological stance, because following Descartes, they say what I know most clearly is my subjectivity, but they try not to follow him in deducing a separate objectivity. But nevertheless, you know, this experience is sort of the ground from which not only epistemology begins, but ontology begins, is this experience. And then, whereas, and then maybe, but I just, what I see Schelling.
Is this just my internet or?
He is what?
No, you've been cutting out, I think, for us.
Sorry.
Oh yeah,
Try
your
again.
internet has been cutting out.
It was only for like
Seems-
30 seconds. Yeah,
Seems
just try.
fine now though, but so to actually address your point, so I get what you're saying now. I definitely misunderstood before, but I think he's definitely trying to do something more like Heidegger in the sense of trying to, well, so he wants to kind of connect both of those ideas, of the subject and the object, and show how they have to be integrated. So I think in those terms, where he's looking at it from maybe from a phenomenological point of view, is he is looking at it from, like the experience of freedom seems to be a thing, or the feeling of freedom. And the way that he's referring to kind of like animate activity and vitality makes you think that it's kind of like if he's coming from anywhere in terms of, like, where is he exactly looking for essential structures of meaning kind of in this experiential field, it would be kind of along the lines of, this kind of organic sort of vitalism, it seems like. And that's also where he's somewhat seems to be talking about this feeling of freedom. But I think, on the other hand, he is still using. So, Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger eventually, they're going to get rid of those terms of, subject and object, and the whole ontology of the subject and ontology of the object, which I think is very much kind of like what we're talking about, or at least what I was talking about with that notion of, the idealistic kind of implementation of evil or whatnot, is kind of that mode of like this all-powerful subject that stands over this completely passive object world. And I think Schelling definitely is going to want to, well, he says basically he wants to integrate realism and idealism, which I take to be the subject and object or something kind of like that. And that's also also the I-hood and the all, I take that as to be the same thing, in the sense the I-hood is this, the subject, and then the all would be that aspect of the object world, I guess. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly where the grounds. He's definitely not like doing a Cartesian thing necessarily, where he's saying that just the subject is, what we can know first and foremost, and then from there we extrapolate out from that. It seems like he respects that in a sense, and he's saying, yeah, okay, we know I-ness from our experience of it, but what are the conditions of nature that make this possible to have this I-hood? So that's where that kind of reversal would come into place. So I think that's kind of, how he integrates those things and how he kind of compares to phenomenology. And I've been talking for way too long now, so I'm going to shut up.
It's a few minutes after 7. Should we adjourn, or would someone like to?
I want someone to make a closing statement.
Bless us, O Lord, and these thy gifts, which we are about to receive through thy bountiful hands through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
I learned that from my grandmother, who was Catholic. I was Southern Baptist, so I didn't learn that first. That was like secondhand. So I may have got it wrong.
Yeah, the Catholic stuff has always mystified me. I constantly make mistakes when I go to Catholic churches, and eventually I just learned to embrace it, and I'll intentionally make as many mistakes as possible and commit as many faux pas as possible. It's awesome.
I went to a silent meditation retreat once that was run by a Catholic group. And at the end of it, they had a mass, and, it was run by a priest. And I was kind of caught up in the emotion of it, and, was all, this is really great. And so we went to take communion, which I had never done before. And I did the cross backward. I don't know, the Orthodox do it one way, the Catholics do it the other way. And boy, did the priest give me a funny look. It's like,
well, see, I'm familiar with the Hermetic Kabbalistic tradition of Western occultism, and the Kabbalists, they do it the reverse way. So that's the way I do it. And it's extremely clear that, I'm not a Catholic, and the priest always, I'm not supposed to be taking communion, and I've been reminded of this multiple times, but I'll do it because that goes into like my whole theology really of Gnostic Luciferianism, but it's after 7, so yeah.
well, I confessed my sin to the nun who was running the contemplative thing, and she just patted me on the back and said, "Honey, God doesn't care." So that was comforting. Okay.
God doesn't give a shit.
Yeah. We'll see you next week. Chuck, I don't know if you guys know Chuck from Supernatural. God is a real asshole.
I think my mom watches that show.
Oh, God is Chuck, and Chuck is terrible. So anyway, we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.